Hello, I'm Rabbi Abramson. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Shof'tim. The name of the portion literally means judges, and the portion deals largely with the justice system of ancient Israel. It includes the general instruction to establish a judicial system. It delineates some of the structure of the judicial system, and there is a variety of other legal structures and ethical maxims in the portion. Most of these legal institutions and regulations were in force in ancient Israel, but no longer are in force today. Most of them, therefore, are perhaps unfamiliar to us. And so it's especially easy to assume that they have no relevance to our lives. But laws are more than simply ways of regulating behavior, much more than simply thou shalt or thou shalt not. In Jewish tradition, laws are, on one level or another, statements of values, therefore ways of imparting values to others. And so our questions when considering even outdated material in the Torah are, what are the values implicit in this law? And what influence is this law trying to have on my consciousness, on my values? Well, let's take a cursory glance at some of the material in this week's portion. We begin in Deuteronomy chapter 16 with some instructions regarding judges and officers. And then in the next verse, the Torah presents, in a sense, the culmination or the bottom line of the Torah portion. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 20. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice shall you pursue. We'll come back to this point in a little while. Deuteronomy chapter 19 presents another curious mitzvah known as hasagat gvul. Deuteronomy 19:14. Lo tasig gvul re'acha. You shall not remove the landmark of your neighbor. The pshat, the simple meaning of this verse is, it is forbidden to remove one's neighbor's landmark, thereby obscuring the end of the neighbor's property and the beginning of one's own property in an attempt to acquire more land. While the verse speaks of physical landmarks and deals with encroaching upon someone's physical property, the rabbis understood this prohibition to include any sort of encroachment upon another person's territory, one's livelihood, one's honor, etc. Competition is all well and good, but there are limits to what we may do in relation to those we are in competition with. And Deuteronomy chapter 20 delineates many of the laws of warfare. Toward the beginning of the chapter, we learn that some people are exempt from military service, and this exemption is prescribed by the Torah without any sort of stigma attached to those who fall into those categories. Most Israelite men within a certain age range have an obligation to serve militarily in the ancient Israelite community, but some are exempt. Further, Deuteronomy chapter 20 tells us that peace must be offered to the enemy and refused by them before the Israelites can besiege a city. Do you think you're in a situation of a legitimate war? Maybe you are, but your obligation still is to offer peace to your enemy, and only after your enemy has declined your offer of peace are you allowed to besiege your enemy's city. And when besieging a city, one may not devastate the land by cutting down fruit-bearing trees. This mitzvah is the basis for an entire area of Jewish law. The biblical prohibition known as Bal Tashchit goes far beyond the laws of warfare. Bal Tashchit forbids the wanton destruction of anything. Bal Tashchit forbids us to be wasteful. Bal Tashchit forbids us to be extravagant. To put it in contemporary terms, Bal Tashchit requires us to be environmentally responsible. But back to the laws of warfare. When we are besieging a city, Bal Tashchit forbids us from destroying fruit trees. If war is hell, as General Sherman said more than 150 years ago, the biblical laws of warfare were intended to help the Israelites from descending into the barbarity to which any warfaring nation is prey, in the ancient world and unfortunately in the modern world as well. There are limits to what we may do when contemplating war against an enemy. And once engaged in that war, there are limits to what we may do in pursuit of victory. Let's return now to the Torah's underlying concern for the Israelites: tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue. Justice shall prevail in all of our dealings with our fellow human beings, personal, legal, political, commercial, even military. This general concern for justice finds its expression in the specific mitzvot we've looked at. Rules regarding the judicial system remind us that we must be diligent in preserving justice and avoiding the traps which lead to injustice. The prohibition of hasagat gvul, encroachment upon another person's territory, requires justice in interpersonal relationships. And the laws of warfare help us to ensure that there is a limit on what one may do, even in a necessary war. All of these rules are intended to ensure that justice prevails. But the curious language of the underlying principle, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue, suggests that the Torah is demanding more than simple fulfillment of minimal standards of justice. What does it mean, after all, to pursue justice? How is this different from behaving justly? After all, according to the prophet Micah, one of God's fundamental demands is asot mishpat, doing justice, behaving justly. But tzedek, tzedek tirdof tells us to do more than simply behaving justly. Rather, you shall pursue justice. You shall learn justice. You shall grow in justice. Justice should not simply guide your behavior, it should permeate your consciousness. These laws, then, are not simply specific guidelines for behavior. They are statements of values intended to have an effect on our consciousness, on our moral development. Another mitzvah in this week's Torah portion reinforces this point. It is known as the ritual of the Eglah Arufa, and it is a strange, exotic ritual. And it too is no longer in practice in contemporary Judaism, but that's not really the point. Here's the biblical description of this curious mitzvah. And this all comes from Deuteronomy chapter 21. When the victim of an unknown murderer is found in a field, the elders of the nearest city shall take a young, unworked heifer and take it to an unplowed valley, and there they shall break the heifer's neck. In the presence of the priests, the elders shall then wash their hands over the heifer. Then the elders shall make the following declaration: Yadenu lo shafachu et hadam hazeh. Our hands have not shed this blood. Ve'einenu lo ra'u, and our eyes have not seen the crime. Kaper la'amcha Yisrael. God, forgive your people Israel. And as a result of this curious ritual, v'nikaper lahem hadam, the blood shall be forgiven them. What in the world is this mitzvah all about? Rav Yitzchak Abravanel, writing in the 15th century, asked, how can the blood of an innocent heifer atone for a murder? And if the Israelites are innocent, after all, the elders made the declaration that they are not guilty of the crime. But if the Israelites are innocent, then why is atonement necessary? Moses Maimonides, writing in the 12th century, suggests that the ritual performs a practical function. He writes, the investigation, the procession of the elders, and the taking of the heifer make people talk about it. And by making the event public, the murderer may be found out. Thus, in Maimonides' opinion, the ritual is to aid in the possible solving of the crime. Moses Nachmanides, writing about a century after Moses Maimonides, disagrees with Maimonides. Was this elaborate ritual just for public information that might lead to the apprehension of the murderer, he asks? Why then was atonement necessary? The purpose, according to Nachmanides, was public education. The ritual was intended to shock the residents of the area with the knowledge that a murder had been committed. And what was the atonement ritual for? The Talmud explains. Would we ever imagine that the Beit Din, the court of elders, were shedders of blood? Of course not. The atonement ritual and disavowal of sin implies the victim did not come to us and then we let him take his leave without food, and we did not see him and then leave him alone to depart without an escort. In other words, the elders of the city are called upon to atone for any indirect possibility for this unsolved murder. It was the elders' responsibility to look out for needy, vulnerable people, some of whom become victims of violence. And where the community fails to take care of the needy, the leaders of the community must atone. What are the lessons to be learned from this? For one thing, our obligation to other people, even to the wandering stranger in our community. Our common responsibility, our responsibility to the haves and to the have-nots. And when a murder is committed and the identity of the murderer is unknown, the community must accept a certain amount of responsibility. Do you remember Kitty Genovese? If you're my age or older, you may remember that name. Kitty Genovese was a 28-year-old woman who was stabbed to death outside of her New York apartment in 1964. The New York Times reported that 38 neighbors looked down from their apartment windows and didn't do a thing. Nobody rushed down from their apartments to try to aid Kitty Genovese, as for, I believe, more than 5 minutes, she screamed for somebody to help. She screamed for her life to be saved. No one came down to help. No one even picked up the phone to call the police. And even if subsequent reinvestigations and retellings might have diminished some details of the story, the death of Kitty Genovese remains an indictment of contemporary American society. Perhaps an indictment that is even more apt today, close to 60 years later. An indictment of our collective insensitivity and irresponsibility to vulnerable people in our midst. That's the point. That's the point of Tzedek Tzedek Tirdof. To learn the lesson that, in the words of Abraham Joshua Heschel, some are guilty, all are responsible. The Torah is concerned with our moral development on 2 levels. Number 1, preventing immoral behavior. And number 2, promoting the development of moral sensitivity. In the modern world especially, things aren't so simple. There are many ethical gray areas in our lives. And it's not always easy to know with certainty what the moral course is. And that's exactly why the Torah is concerned not only with the morality of our behavior in specific cases that present clear ethical choices, but also with our moral sensitivity in a general sense. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. Moral sophistication, ethical sensitivity you shall pursue. The Torah calls upon us to be diligent in ascertaining what is morally correct, in pursuing the course of justice, in acutely concerning ourselves with ethical issues in our religious and secular lives. A very timely lesson from some ancient Jewish sources, and I think especially timely in these weeks before the High Holy Days. Shabbat Shalom.